Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. I'm here today again with Robbie Barwick from the Australian Citizens Party, and this episode is going to be an update on Dan Duggan's case in Australia. I'm not exactly sure what to expect. Robbie just mentioned to me there's some updates that he wanted to share with me, so we'll just take it from here. I think maybe a good place to start is just in case for people who don't really know much about Dan, we just do a very brief introduction on what his case is about.
So Dan Duggan is someone who I regard as a victim of the people who want to create a permanent division between the West and China in the lead up to a war, paving the way for eventual war. And what they're doing is they're demonizing any actual economic engagement with China. They want to create a Cold War and create that division. And he's just someone who has fallen afoul of that because he's a former US Navy Top Gun pilot who became an Australian permanent resident, and then he got married here. He has children, and so he became a naturalized Australian citizen. But because he did training of Chinese pilots at a test flight training school in South Africa in 2012, he was indicted in 2017, much later, by the US Department of Justice and accused of violating the international traffic against arms regulations. And these are the kinds of laws that America has to be able to black ban any country from getting American weapons or American technology, American equipment. And so he's been charged with 2 counts of violating that, 1 count of conspiracy, which basically means he talked to people, and 1 count of money laundering, which basically means he transferred his pay back to Australia. These are very catch-all charges designed to be able to, for the Department of Justice, to load up his case with as a bigger sentence as possible, so that they can justify extraditing him to the United States. That's what they've done. They got him arrested in Australia in 2022. He's been held in prison ever since, coming up to 20 months now that he's been in prison in Australia, away from his family, his wife and 6 kids, including 3 little kids. And it's coming, they've exhausted the courts, Daniel, and
Yep.
it's coming up to D-Day where for the Attorney General of Australia to make a specific ruling in his case about whether an extradition can go ahead.
Okay. Before you get into that, I just want to add some pieces of context from what I understood from our last conversation. In terms of the money laundering charge, this is for money that was transferred in Australia and which he declared and he paid taxes on,
Pay taxes on it.
which it just goes to show the lengths they're going to try to fabricate something here. And then also another important point is throughout his journey with various things that he was doing, whether China was involved or whatever, he was in regular contact with security services, both the Australians and the Americans who showed up in Australia to have a chat with him. And he constantly was asking if what he was doing was okay and making sure along the way that he wasn't going to get in trouble for anything, and that he was in the clear to do that. Not only was he in the clear to do that, what one of his letters revealed was that they actually said, oh, well, maybe there's an opportunity for us here. While you're dealing with Chinese people or you're going to China, maybe you could do some spying for us, or something along the lines of that.
Well, that's essentially the story. But here's the thing. So there's from 2013 onwards, he actually had a business in China as a consultant to the burgeoning Chinese airline industry, which required a lot of training of Chinese pilots as the living standard of the largest population country in the world went up, and the airline industry there just soared. And so he was well positioned to be a consultant to that, and he had a very successful business there. It is most likely that what the Americans really want him for, Daniel, is what he did is related to what he did in China, because that's where they also asked him to spy for them. However, what they're charging him with is something that they've found they could whack together as a series of charges relating to his work in South Africa, which has nothing to do with what he did in China. And so they're using that as a pretext, right? It's just something they've been able to cobble together to create an indictment. And in one sense, that's their business. My argument is, why should the Australian government do their dirty work for him? If there's an issue between Dan Duggan and the intelligence agencies of America over what he did in China, right, where they'd asked him to spy for them, and they don't want to become clean on that, we should not be helping them get him on something that was perfectly legal at the time he did it, because
Right.
that's the.
Yeah. And then there's also the dual criminality issue, that it doesn't really fully meet the requirements for an actual legal extradition also. And then also, of course, they seized the property of his wife to prevent him from being able to raise any funds or sell property to be able to defend himself. And maybe we'll leave the background information there, because a lot of people would have already seen our previous video. But I think from our intro here, you can basically get the idea. It's a bit of a shit show. So then now we can move on to, okay, where is this going? What has happened since, and what are we looking at now?
Okay, so what's happened since we spoke on this case just a few days before his last court appearance, and remember, we asked people to help contribute to that because he needed the legal representation of a very high powered lawyer, and that court appearance determined something quite important, which was that the way the Americans have structured this case against him, and the way the Australian government has assisted them, it is outside the jurisdiction essentially of the Australian courts. And so this rather high-powered lawyer who they were able to secure his services to speak on his behalf, he basically said to the court, to the judge in that court, there is no point having an argument here because you cannot even make the final decisions anyway. The ultimate decisions will be made in two places. One is the Attorney General of Australia, who makes the decision on whether he'll be extradited, and the other is the US courts, right? And so the problem is, once he's in the US courts, he will absolutely not get a fair trial, and the reason for that is the climate of xenophobia, right? We are in a period of high-powered McCarthyism, supercharged McCarthyism, where essentially they want the public to think, and the American public to think, that Dan Duggan trained the enemy. And I'll come back to that in a minute because I've got a good quote. But Dan Duggan did not train the enemy, because in 2012, there was no one talking about China as the enemy. China was a country that everyone wanted to do business with, and he was just doing business with China as well. But now, in the modern climate, the current climate, Dan Duggan trained Chinese pilots. Oh, Dan Duggan trained the enemy. He will never get a fair hearing in America. So it's all important that it comes down to the Attorney General of Australia's decision. Now, that doesn't bode that well, because this is the man who should have intervened to stop David McBride, the war crimes whistleblower in Australia, even going to jail, because he had the power to say that what David McBride did was in the national interest. And therefore, blowing the whistle was, even though it was technically in breach of the law, it was the right thing to do. He had the power to do that. He did not lift a finger to assist David McBride at all. So that doesn't bode well. However, he does have to, he's the top law officer in Australia. He does have to uphold Australian law and the rule of law and all these different things, some of which you've already mentioned, such as the dual criminality thing. If he allows this extradition to go ahead, he has to justify it under the rules of the extradition treaty. And so that comes to a head this week. This week, the Duggan team will submit the final submission, make their final submission to the Attorney General, where they present every possible aspect of this case in response to the US indictment, so the Attorney General can weigh up the two and make his decision. And so that's essentially the main update that I wanted to give people, but the reason I wanted to make sure we talked today is because the Americans were able to intervene and stop Dan's wife, Safrine, selling a property in order to fund his defense. They had a sale to go ahead for $1.2 million. It was all, the contract was signed, it was ready to go ahead. And at the last moment, the Americans challenged it in court under the proceeds of crime rules. And the Australian courts upheld that, even though the Duggans offered to sequester $180,000, which is the money he received from the South African school, on which he paid tax, as you said, right? Because that's the only thing that could be possibly construed as untoward money. Even though they'd offered to do that, no, they froze the whole thing because the Americans do not want a level playing field when it comes to this stuff. They are just, everything they're doing is they've got this family's hands tied behind their back financially while they have to deal with this. So there's an excellent Australian lawyer named Bernard Collaery, who was David McBride's lawyer. He fights these kind of cases. He's working pro bono on this, but they've had to hire some American lawyers on the American side to do important research on that side, and they've come up with some good stuff. But those guys need to be paid, and they're not going to work pro bono, and they need to be paid now. And so the family's desperately trying to raise $50,000 Australian dollars to be able to pay those guys, because the material they've come up with is going to be very important to whether the Attorney General of Australia, if it's possible at all for him to make the right case, whether he will. And so this is coming right down to the wire this week, and Dan needs all the help he can get from people who actually see the big picture here and realize that, there are innocent people like the Duggans that are becoming victims of a runaway agenda, right? That doesn't care who it chews up and spits out on the way. But as I'm an Australian citizen, you're a citizen of a fellow Commonwealth country who does work in China, so you have that in common with Dan Duggan. People who see that this could happen to anybody, and that's why I think we really need to get behind this family and support them.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because they would have had no problem and they wouldn't have had to reach out for help had they been allowed to sell their own property
Right.
in order to do this. And that's the whole point in freezing that. That's the point of trying to make this into a money laundering issue, which is not. He declared it. He paid taxes on it. He brought it into the country. And even when they offered to give up the amount that he made from those activities and say, okay, well, if you're saying this is proceeds for crimes, we'll put this aside until we determine that it is or isn't a crime. But no, they want to freeze the entire thing because this whole point is to basically prevent them from being able to defend themselves effectively. It sounds like the Attorney General, who didn't give any leeway to McBride. He maybe had a little bit of an easier time with McBride because McBride relied on being given leeway, being given a little bit of extra room based on it being for a greater good. Whereas it sounds like they're going to have to do a lot more creative work with Dan here on how they pass him over. Assumingly they want to pass him over, but it's going to be a little bit more work for them. So with just a little bit of help, it sounds like they have a fighting chance, much more so than McBride did.
They have the actual law on their side, but what they don't, and so that's what's important. What they don't have is any kind of honest media to actually report this honestly. They don't have politicians that are prepared to stand up to there's one politician, sorry, I stand corrected. David Shoebridge from the Australian Greens is one of the few politicians in Parliament that's taken up Dan's case. But he's one of 227 politicians in Parliament. The rest aren't touching it because people are afraid to actually take on the might and power of the United States on these cases, right? And so my fear is if the Attorney General just does the dirty on Dan Duggan and says, I don't care about the law, I'm going to approve this anyway, he is probably going to be fairly confident that he's not going to face much in the way of political consequences in the current climate for doing that. That's the worry. So while he has to, now, I'm not dismissing the law. That would be an act of real corruption in my view if he did it. So the law is on Dan's side, but it requires people to argue that law and all those sort of things. And that's where having a proper legal defense is so important. And that hasn't been able to happen. We don't have to talk too long about this tonight because we do have the other show people can refer to. But there is just this one thing I really want people to understand as a dynamic here, and that's what I've already referred to, which is judging the Duggan case in terms of the accusations against him against the current climate, as opposed to what things were like back in 2012, because that's the part that they're trying to get away with. They're taking advantage of how public opinion has shifted over the years, right? Because when he was arrested in 2022, 6 months earlier, our defense minister in our government had said we must prepare for war with China. 6 months later, he gets arrested. That's the climate in Australia now. It's probably moderating a little bit, but it's not moderated that far. That's the climate. We actually talk about war with the biggest population country in the world and one of the mightiest militaries in the world. We're absolutely nuts. But in 2012, that was not the case. And the proof of that is that uh, there was a lot of pilots training Chinese pilots at that South African school. Dan was only one of them. Dan was the only one with an American background, right, who'd been an American citizen, and that's actually one of the reasons that the Americans have targeted him, because they're trying to say, oh, he's our citizen, therefore we're going to apply our laws to him. But the other reason is because they can't touch the other soldiers, the other pilots, trainers, because their laws don't apply to them, and the British have had to come out and say, look, what he did was not illegal under British law. And what our soldiers, our trainers do, our pilots do in South Africa is not illegal under British law. They've since changed the law to make it illegal, but it absolutely was not illegal, and it certainly wasn't illegal in 2012. And do you mind if I play this little clip now?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's just play a clip. Now I'm going to piggyback off our. I played this on our show at the end of last week, Daniel.
Okay.
Just a very short clip. I'll just set it up. This is from the UK Parliament, a hearing in March 2023. This is from a hearing, and this person you're seeing on the screen, he's about to ask a question to Air Chief Marshal Sir Mike Wigston about this breaking news about this scandal of pilots training Chinese pilots in South Africa, right? So you'll hear the question and then pay attention to the answer.
Going on for many years, and it goes back to a period when we took a different approach to China. We took a much more engaging approach. We did training. It was formal. We had state visits. The Red Arrows went and displayed in China in 2016. Yep. And so for those people that went and became contractors, helping in simulators, helping with flying training at that stage, I can understand why they would have felt that it was a reasonable thing to do.
That's interesting. So, I mean, he's not specifically talking about Dan there, but he's talking about in general their pilots who have been doing the same thing, saying, well, yeah.
Same thing, same venue. Right.
The same venue also, the exact same training center, right?
Exactly same company. They all worked for the same company. This was the extraordinary thing about that, what he had to admit there. And he went on to say, you know, this is not good enough. And of course, they've gone and changed the law now. But that was just the facts of the matter. And he actually got the date wrong. The Red Arrows didn't fly in 2016. It was 2018.
Oh, right? Even later.
Recently as 2018, that kind of engagement had been the case. Because what happened was, of course, Trump got elected in late 2016. And people often trace the anti-China shift in Western policy to Trump's election. It had actually started a bit before that. But the Trump White House certainly supercharged it with people like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and these absolute monsters, right? They want this war. But there was a lag, though, because it took a while for all the rest of the countries to get the memo, right? That how serious the Americans were about this. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who's a total thug now, you would not find a bigger China hater in the world now than Scott Morrison. We got a quote from him in June 2019 saying, Australia welcomes Belt and Road for all the opportunities it will bring to the region, right? But then once that was all cracked down on, then we all towed the line. Yeah,
I mean, this is the weird thing, isn't it? Like, what is it about this dynamic that makes him or other politicians not want to stand up for Dan and to follow along with it? Is it both that there's a chance that they would be smeared if they didn't go along with it? And is it just because the American narrative on China has proliferated so much that it would be unpopular with the masses also to say anything other than, oh, this guy was, tied up with China, we better go after him, and just basically toe the line on all this stuff? Like, what? I mean, I know you don't follow this, but you've been smeared many, many times. So is that part of it? I like to discourage people to go against the grain and to just kind of follow along with these narratives.
Well, I think I think the one part that's shifting is public opinion. This would actually, you would not be that offside with public opinion now if you're a politician who took up Dan Duggan's case, because it's a hugely sympathetic case, right? It's a real Australian family. His wife and 6 kids are absolutely devastated. People really relate to that. What the politicians are as cowards, though, even the ones who are sympathetic, they would be terrified, because they would definitely come under attack by the Wolverine element in our parliament. These are the toadies, that the shameless toadies of the United States who get around our parliament. They would attack them, but then so would the media. The media would come in on this stuff as well, right? And that's terrifying to any of these politicians. And frankly, given the stakes, how high they are, I can't give you I can't vouch for this. I just know the history of our engagement as a country with the United States when we've tried to assert more independence as opposed to now. And the politicians who did paid for it. They paid for it big time, right? The American embassy is very, very influential in Australia, and you will suffer if you cross them on an agenda that they have. And so I think there's an implied threat there if there's not an actual threat. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an actual threat. Hell, Daniel, a week ago, the probable next president of the United States would have been dead if he hadn't have moved his head at the last second, right? Yeah. There are high stakes in the world, and when we ask the question why would anyone want to get rid of Trump, the only thing that's interesting about Trump, frankly, is the things he says that make him at odds with the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment, not on China, but on NATO and Ukraine,
and Russia. Yeah.
But it's a really big deal what he's at odds with them on, right? And these guys play for keeps. And there are some really, really nasty factions in the United States that want to escalate these tensions with China at all costs. They want to pick a fight over Taiwan, etc. And they want to make sure that Australia, which they've turned us into like this, unsinkable aircraft carrier for them already. We've got all these military bases. We will be if they get a war, the war will be fought from Australia, right? They've got probably nuclear armed B-52 bombers up in the Northern Territory. They've got nuclear submarines off Perth, as a base off Perth, etc. They've got the most important actual listening post in the world outside of the United States in the center of Australia called Pine Gap. I mean, we are totally occupied by the American military. But the paradox is this is contradicted by the fact that we have the single most beneficial trade relationship with China of any country on earth. No country benefits more from trade with China than Australia. And so as the Australian people weigh this up, do we want war or do we want a great income from trading with China? Well, it's obvious what most people are going to pick out of common sense. And so this very nasty faction is trying to blow all that up, demonize all that, terrify anyone who does business in China. And Daniel Duggan becomes a very convenient scapegoat, a very convenient example that they can make, like putting someone's head on a pike to send a message to everybody else. Be afraid, be very afraid.
Right.
And politicians are the first to get the message, mate.
Basically making an example out of him. And for people who, obviously we're going to put a link to show where people can support him to try to raise funds for his defense. And this is about so much more than just him, because if he loses this, even when the law is on his side, you can just imagine how quickly things are going to slide from there, and how many other people they can go after who just don't toe the party line enough, or whatever it is that they want to
100%.
go after them for. It's gonna set. Even if people don't particularly empathize with Dan that much specifically, the implications of this going down the road are going to be huge.
We'll compare it to Julian Assange, for instance, right? We're all super happy and stoked for Julian Assange and Stella, his wife, etc., that he's out of prison. But there's a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, and it's no fault of Julian's. But he had to plead guilty in order to finally get freed. And the
example's already been made. Also, he spent this much time rotting in a prison.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. People can't say, "Oh, well, you see, justice. He got free." No, the example was already made. Even if he gets, Yeah, even if he gets his charges overturned, and even if he gets compensation in the future, it doesn't matter. Nobody would want to go through what he went through. The example has been made.
And it
It
was accepted
accomplished what it needed to.
it was accepted by too many people, right,
Yeah.
etc. So in a case like this, where we've gone from the summer of bounty with China, great times, great relationships, etc., and then hit this winter of discontent and people trying to manipulate this outcome. The Australians will get the message if this extradition goes ahead, right? And the relationship that we have with China will be chilled, as will the relationship of any country in the Five Eyes. This is all the Five Eyes countries being targeted. In fact, they have already achieved one of their objectives, which was to get all these countries like Australia and Canada and the United Kingdom to pass these laws criminalising after the fact what Dan Duggan was doing entirely legally, right? So now there's no doubt it's a crime if someone does that, but that wasn't the case at the time. The only place that's not a crime, Daniel, to train Chinese pilots?
No.
The United States. 70% of Chinese pilots are trained in the United States, and the pilots all come from exactly the same. There's an organization in China that organizes all these pilots to be sent out for their training. It's the same place that sent them to South Africa, and the South African government even vetted them before they got there, sends them to the United States, right? Because they got a place in the Mojave Desert in Northern California, this big national test training academy thing that they do, right? And they make squillions training these guys. They're loving it. They brag about it. You can go on their website and they brag about it, right? How much they train Chinese pilots. But no one in Canada, Australia, or UK is going.
I mean, that's unbelievable. I mean, that just shows how ridiculous the whole case is, considering where it's coming from. I mean, it's probably already serving its purpose, and it will more so if he is actually extradited to further nurture this system where people in Australia know that, okay, all right, when the U.S. says something, we should really follow along with it because of what they're able to do, even when the law is on your side. I mean, this is, like I said, it's such an important case. So what I'll do is, I mean, you have a link for me that, like I said, where people can donate to his case. I'll put that in the description.
This is their legal fighting fund. Any help people can give them, please do. It's absolutely greatly appreciated. It's the only thing they survive on is these donations from the public to help fight this case. So if you empathise with this case at all, please make a donation. Small or large, whatever you can do. This family
or empathize with the consequences of what will happen from this case, even if like I said, are not paying attention to this one specific guy.
They're taking on the full might of the US government with their hands tied behind their back financially, completely unfairly, right? And that is just, and this is how the American system works. This is why the Department of Justice has like a 99% conviction rate. They treat people appallingly. They get them in prison. They subject them to awful conditions. They make all sorts of threats, and the whole purpose is to get them to plead guilty, right? So they get their guilty plea. They get to pass laws based on it. They get cited as evidence, and it's all garbage, and it's all based on intimidating people. But this is happening to an innocent Australian family. As I said to you last time, the difference between Dan Duggan and people like David McBride and Julian Assange is those guys are real heroes. They took up the mantle of trying to change something, right? They didn't deserve what happened to them, but they were taking up a fight for the world. Dan Duggan is just a guy who's just walked blindfold into a wasp nest, right? He was just getting on with his life, and this happened to him. He didn't seek it out. By any objective measure, he should be respected as a patriotic hero of America's armed forces, right? Who did a dangerous job, is a really skillful guy and did what many, many other people did, but instead they have an agenda and they're determined to make examples of people to enforce that agenda. And in this case, it's a lovely Australian family that are being destroyed by this. So there is a chance, if we support, that we can get the Attorney General to make the right choice. Please help.
Absolutely. Okay. I think that's a good note to wrap up on. And if we have any future updates, we'll bring you back on and we'll figure out what happens. I guess Wednesday's the big day. We'll see what happens after that. In the meantime, I'll share the link for everybody to contribute to. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks. I'll chat to you soon.